The divorce attorney's office smelled like old money and expensive cologne. I sat across from Victoria Hayes, a razor-thin woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen every flavor of marital destruction. She'd built her reputation on eviscerating powerful men, and she'd done it so ruthlessly that even the most arrogant hedge fund managers trembled at the mention of her name. That I'd been smart enough to hire her years ago, when I'd first started suspecting Ethan's infidelities. I'd never followed through, of course. I'd been too weak, too desperate, too afraid of being alone. But I'd kept her card. In the back of my wallet, behind the grocery store loyalty cards and the library membership I never used. Funny how those small acts of self-preservation could save your life. Victoria scanned the documents I'd brought, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper. She didn't speak for a long time. She just read, her expression impassive, while I sat across from her and tried to keep my hands from shaking. Finally, she set down the papers and looked at me. You've got him on fraud, financial mismanagement, and at least 3 instances of falsifying documents for tax purposes. The offshore accounts alone could land him in federal prison. I know. And you're willing to use this information. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. A lot of women say they want revenge, but when it comes down to actually destroying their ex-husband's life, they hesitate. I met her gaze without flinching. I didn't lose my arm so he could walk away with everything I built. Victoria's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Good. Then let's talk strategy. The strategy was simple, brutal, and beautiful. I would file for divorce on grounds of infidelity, citing Miranda as the correspondent. The financial irregularities would be a secondary weapon, held in reserve in case Ethan tried to fight back. I'd make it clear that I had enough evidence to destroy him professionally and personally, but I'd offer him a way out. An amicable settlement that left me with a fair share of our assets and his reputation intact. He'd take the deal. He was too arrogant to believe I'd actually follow through on my threats. And then I'd destroy him anyway. Victoria warned me that revenge was a double-edged sword, that the satisfaction of watching Ethan suffer wouldn't heal the wounds he'd inflicted. She'd seen it happen before, she said. Women who'd spent years plotting against their exes only to find themselves hollow and empty when the dust settled. I thanked her for her concern and told her I'd take my chances. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. I met with forensic accountants, private investigators, and financial analysts. I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find on Ethan's illegal activities, building a file so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. I documented Miranda's gambling debts, her side business, her attempts to siphon money from my personal accounts. And I did it all while maintaining the perfect facade of the broken wife. I called Ethan repeatedly, leaving tearful voicemails. I texted Miranda, asking her to explain, to help me understand, to give me closure. I posted sad, ambiguous statuses on social media, carefully curated to suggest that I was devastated but hopeful. They bought it completely. Ethan started spending even more time with Miranda, emboldened by my apparent collapse. Miranda, for her part, began posting photos of their platonic dinners and weekend trips, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. I gave them exactly what they wanted. I sent Ethan a tearful email telling him I was going to stay with my sister for a while, that I needed time to heal, that I still loved him and hoped he'd come back to me. It was a lie, of course. My sister lived in Seattle, and I hadn't spoken to her in years. But Ethan didn't know that. He didn't know anything about me, really. He never had. The day I filed for divorce, I stood in my bedroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked different than she had a month ago. Her face was still pale, but there was color in her cheeks now. Her hair was still mousy, but she'd stopped hiding it under cheap scarves. Her arm was still gone, but she'd started wearing short sleeves, showing the scarred stump like a badge of honor. You're not broken, I told my reflection. You never were. The divorce papers were filed electronically at exactly 9 a.m. I'd timed it to coincide with Ethan's morning meeting, knowing he'd check his phone the moment he stepped out of the boardroom. I imagined his face when he saw the notification. The shock. The anger. The slow, dawning realization that his pathetic, broken wife had finally grown a spine. The fantasy kept me smiling all day. Ethan called me at 6:00 p.m. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, my voice carefully modulated to sound fragile and confused. Ethan, is that you? What the hell is this? His voice was sharp, furious. I just got served with divorce papers. You're suing me for adultery. You're claiming financial misconduct. I'm claiming what's mine, I said, dropping the fragile act. The money I earned. The assets I helped build. The life you stole from me. I could almost hear his teeth grinding. You think you can do this? You think you can take me on? I don't think I can, I said sweetly. I know I can. I have a file, Ethan. A very thick file. It contains everything I need to destroy you. Every lie you've told. Every deal you've fudged. Every person you've screwed over on your way to the top. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was cold, calculating. You're bluffing. Try me. Another silence. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much I could prove, how much damage I could actually do. What do you want? He asked finally. I want a fair settlement. Half of everything. The house. The savings. The investment accounts. And I want you to publicly acknowledge our divorce and admit to your infidelity. That's ridiculous. You're out of your mind. Then I'll take my file to the authorities. I'm sure the IRS would love to know about your offshore accounts. And the SEC would be fascinated by your insider trading. And your investors. I paused, letting the words sink in. Well, let's just say I don't think they'd be happy to learn how their money's been spent. Ethan was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was defeated. Fine. You win. I'll have my lawyer contact yours. Good boy. I hung up before he could say anything else, and I felt a surge of triumph so intense it almost made me dizzy. The first battle was won. But the war was just beginning. I didn't stop with Ethan. I'd been thinking a lot about Miranda, about the years of manipulation and betrayal, about the way she'd smiled at me while stabbing me in the back. She'd been my best friend for a decade, and she'd systematically dismantled my life piece by piece. It was time to return the favor. I started with her employer. I sent an anonymous tip to her boss, detailing her gambling debts and the illegal side business she'd been running under their radar. The tip was thorough, professional, and utterly devastating. Within a week, Miranda had been fired. I heard about it through the grapevine. She'd called Ethan crying and he'd called me screaming. I listened to his rage with a calm satisfaction and told him I had no idea what he was talking about. You're doing this, he said, his voice shaking with fury. You're destroying her life to get back at me. I'm not doing anything, I said innocently. I'm just living my life. If Miranda's life falls apart, that's her problem. Maybe she should have been a better friend. Ethan hung up on me. I smiled and poured myself a glass of wine. The weeks turned into months. The divorce was finalized, and I walked away with a settlement that would keep me comfortable for the rest of my life. Ethan's business started to crumble as his investors grew nervous, and I watched from a distance as the empire he'd built on lies began to collapse. Miranda disappeared. I didn't know where she went, and I didn't care. She'd taken everything from me, and I'd taken everything from her. We were even. And yet, as the dust settled and the anger faded, I found myself feeling empty. I'd gotten what I wanted. I'd destroyed Ethan and Miranda. I'd reclaimed my life, my money, my dignity. And there was nothing left for me to fight for. I spent the first few months after the divorce in a haze. I traveled, I shopped, I did all the things I'd never been able to do when I was married. But nothing filled the void. Nothing made me feel whole again. I'd spent so long hating Ethan and Miranda that I'd forgotten how to love anything else. And then one night, I met James. He was at a charity gala. The same kind of event I'd spent years attending on Ethan's arm. I'd almost stayed home. But something had pushed me out the door. A need to prove to myself that I could still exist in the world without being defined by my marriage. James was tall, dark-haired, and devastatingly handsome. He was also blind. I noticed him immediately, not because of his disability, but because of the way he carried himself. He moved through the crowd with a confidence that was almost arrogant, his dark glasses hiding eyes that I later learned were the color of warm honey. He approached me at the bar, ordering a whiskey with the ease of a man who'd made a peace with his limitations. You're new here, he said, turning toward me with a smile that made my heart skip. I know everyone at these things. You're not a regular. I laughed, surprised. How could you tell? He tapped his ear. I listen. The regulars all sound the same, bored, entitled, full of themselves. You sound different. Like you'd rather be anywhere else but you're pretending to enjoy it. I felt something shift inside me. A warmth I hadn't felt in years. You're a good listener, I said that I've had to be. He smiled again, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. So, what's your story? I told him. Not everything, not the ugly details, but enough. Enough to make him understand who I was and what I'd been through. He listened without interrupting, without judging, without pity. And when I was done, he reached across the bar and took my hand, my good hand, in his. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, he said. And I'd like to get to know you better. If you'll let me. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Tears I hadn't let myself cry since the night Ethan left. I'd like that. I said that the weeks with James were unlike anything I'd ever experienced, that he was patient and kind and utterly unafraid of my scars. He touched my empty sleeve without hesitation, ran his fingers over the scarred stump as if it were beautiful. He never flinched, never pitied me, never treated me like I was broken. And he loved me. Really truly loved me. Not for what I could do for him, not for the money I had, not for the sacrifices I'd made. He loved me because I was me. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. That I started to rebuild my life. I went back to school, studying business and finance. I started a small consulting firm, helping other women navigate the treacherous waters of divorce and financial independence. I built a new life, a life I'd never imagined possible. And every night, I went home to James. But happy endings aren't the end of the story. That it was a Thursday when Ethan showed up at my door. He looked different, older, thinner, his eyes hollow with defeat. The arrogant man I'd married was gone, replaced by a shell of who he'd once been. Emma, he said, his voice cracking. I need your help. I stared at him, and for a moment I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. Just a deep, weary emptiness. Ethan, I said calmly. You need to leave. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But Miranda's gone, and I've lost everything, and I have nowhere else to go. Please, just give me one more chance. I looked at him, at the man who'd destroyed my life, and I felt something shift inside me. That not forgiveness. Never that. But something else. Something that felt a lot like moving on. You're right, I said. You did mess up. You hurt me more than you could ever imagine. But I'm not angry anymore. I'm not anything. You're not. No. I stepped back, letting him see my life, the home I'd built, the happiness I'd found, the love I'd earned. I moved on, Ethan. I found someone who actually loves me, someone who sees my scars and thinks they're beautiful, someone who would never, ever say I deserved to lose my arm. His face crumpled. Emma, goodbye, Ethan. I closed the door and walked back to James, who was waiting in the living room with his hand extended. Who was it? He asked. A nobody, I said. Just a ghost from my past. He pulled me into his arms, and I let myself fall into his embrace. I felt his heart beating against my chest, steady and strong. And I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. That the ghost was gone. And I was finally, truly alive. End of chapter 2. The call came at 3:00 a.m. That I was tangled in James's arms, drifting in the warm current of a dreamless sleep, when my phone started screaming from the nightstand. The sound was jarring, aggressive, slicing through the quiet of our bedroom like a blade. I fumbled for it, my heart already pounding with the instinctual terror that comes with middle-of-the-night emergencies. James stirred beside me, his hand finding my hip in the darkness. Emma, what is it? I didn't answer. I was staring at the screen, at the name that flashed across it like a curse. Sophie. Ethan's sister. The little girl I'd saved. The reason I'd lost my right arm. That she was 19 now. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. Not since she'd sent me a letter calling me a broken wreck, and telling me to stop playing the victim. She'd been 17 then, young and cruel and angry at the world. And I tried not to take it personally. But I'd never forgotten the words. They'd burrowed into my chest like splinters, festering in the dark spaces I couldn't reach. I answered the call. Sophie. Emma. Her voice was raw, ragged, barely recognizable. Emma, I need you. Please. I don't know who else to call. I sat up, my heart racing. What happened? Are you hurt? A sob cut through her words. I don't know where else to go. I've been so stupid, Emma. So unbelievably stupid. I thought I could handle it myself, but I can't. I can't handle anything. I looked at James. He was sitting up now, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the curtains. He couldn't see her, couldn't see the fear etched into my expression, but he could feel it. He reached for my hand and squeezed. Where are you? I asked. At my apartment. I'm at my apartment. But I'm scared. I think someone's outside. Is it Ethan? Did he do something to you? No. No, it's not Ethan. It's worse. Her voice cracked. Please, Emma. I know I don't deserve your help. I know I've been a terrible person. But I don't have anyone else. Mom and Dad are in Europe, and Ethan. She stopped, her breath hitching. Ethan's the one who got me into this. I felt the words like a physical blow. What did he do? I'll explain when you get here. Just please. Please come. I was already pulling on clothes. I'm on my way. Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone. The drive to Sophie's apartment took 20 minutes. James insisted on coming with me. His hand on my knee the entire way. He didn't ask questions. He'd learned early in our relationship that I would tell him what I needed to tell him when I was ready. He just sat there, a steady presence in the passenger seat, anchoring me to the moment. I hadn't seen Sophie since the divorce. I'd wanted to once. She'd been just a child when I'd pushed her out of the way of that SUV, just a scared little girl with her whole life ahead of her. I'd loved her like she was my own sister. And she'd repaid that love by calling me broken, by telling me to stop playing the victim, by siding with Ethan when he'd torn my life apart. But I still remembered the way she'd held my hand in the hospital, the way she'd looked at my bandaged arm with tears streaming down her face and whispered, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. I told her it wasn't her fault. I told her I'd do it again, 1,000 times, if it meant saving her life. I meant it then. I still meant it now. Sophie's apartment was in a rundown building on the edge of the city. The halls smelled like mildew and desperation. The kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you'd left. I knocked on her door 3 sharp raps, and waited. The door opened a crack. Sophie peered out at me with red-rimmed eyes. And I felt something in my chest crack. She was so young. Too young. Her face was gaunt, hollowed out by stress and sleepless nights. There were dark circles under her eyes, a haunted quality to her gaze that made my stomach turn. Emma. She opened the door wider, and I saw the rest of her. She was wearing a dirty sweatshirt and leggings, her hair a tangled mess. There were bruises on her arms, fingerprints shaped like hands. My blood went cold. Sophie, what happened to you? She crumpled into my arms, sobbing, and I held her. I held her like I'd held her in the hospital years ago, like I'd held her when she was 9 and terrified and bleeding. I held her like she was the sister I'd always wanted, like she was my own child, like she was everything I'd lost and everything I'd never had. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. For everything. For what I said to you, for how I treated you. I was so stupid, Emma. I believed everything Ethan told me. I thought you were the bad one, that you were just trying to ruin his life. But he's a monster. He's always been a monster. I guided her inside the apartment. It was a disaster. Clothes everywhere, dishes piled in the sink, the faint smell of something rotting in the corner. But the blinds were drawn, and the lock was bolted, and there was a baseball bat leaning against the doorframe. What happened? I asked again, my voice steady. What did Ethan do? Sophie sank onto the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. He borrowed money from me. A lot of money. He said he needed it to get back on his feet, that he'd pay me back as soon as he got his business going again. And I believed him. He's my brother. He's my family. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. How much? All of it. My savings. My inheritance from Grandma. Everything. She looked at me, her eyes desperate. I know I shouldn't have given it to him. I know he's not trustworthy. But he was so convincing. He said he'd changed, that he was trying to be a better person. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that my brother wasn't the monster you said he was. But he is. He is. Her voice broke. He lost it all. He invested it in some scheme that crashed and burned, and now he's gone. I haven't heard from him in weeks. And now. She gestured at the bruises on her arms. Now these people are coming after me. They want the money back. They don't care that Ethan took it. They only care that my name was on the documents. I sat down beside her, my mind racing. Did you file a police report? He said he'd kill me if I did. She started crying again. Emma, I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. You're going to be okay. Promise. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. But why? She pulled back, looking at me with confusion and shame. After everything I said to you, after how I treated you, why would you help me? I looked at her, at this girl who'd been so cruel and so young and so lost, and I felt the weight of all the years I'd spent carrying my anger. Because you're worth saving, I said. You were worth saving then, and you're worth saving now. What happened between us doesn't change that. Sophie broke down, sobbing into my shoulder, and I held her until the tears stopped. That I didn't sleep that night. That instead, I made calls. I contacted my lawyer, my private investigator, everyone I could think of who might be able to help Sophie. I set up a plan for her safety, a new apartment, a new identity, a way out of the nightmare her brother had created. And I started to think about Ethan. He'd borrowed money from his own sister. He'd taken her inheritance, her safety, her future. And when the scheme had fallen apart, he'd left her to face the consequences alone. This was the man I'd once loved. The man I'd given my arm for. The man who'd watched me burn and walked away. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about protection. About making sure Sophie was safe. About ensuring that Ethan couldn't hurt anyone else. I called James and told him I was staying at Sophie's. He didn't argue, didn't ask questions. He just said, I'll be here when you get back. I loved him for that. I loved him for so many reasons, but I loved him most for the way he never made me feel like I had to explain myself. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal filings and security measures. We found Ethan eventually. Or rather, the private investigator I'd hired found him. He was living in a basement apartment on the other side of town, alone and broke and desperate. He'd lost his business, his money, his reputation. He had nothing left. I went to see him once. I told myself it was because I needed answers, because I needed to understand how he could do such terrible things to the people who loved him. But the truth was simpler than that. I needed to see him broken. I needed to see the man who'd destroyed me reduced to nothing. That it was raining the night I found him. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the water dripped from the awnings in a steady, mournful rhythm. I stood outside his door for a long time, working up the courage to knock. When he opened it, he looked like a stranger. He was thinner than I remembered, his skin sallow and his eyes hollow. There was a bottle of whiskey in his hand, and the room behind him was a disaster. Empty bottles and fast food wrappers and the detritus of a man who'd given up. Emma. He said my name like he was surprised to see me. What are you doing here? Sophie, I said. You almost got her killed. He laughed, a bitter sound that sent chills down my spine. Sophie. Of course. You were always so good at playing the hero. Ethan. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. What happened to you? How did you become this person? He looked at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that looked almost like regret. I don't know, he said, his voice hoarse. I was supposed to be great, Emma. I was supposed to have everything. And instead I lost everything, and it's all because of you. Because of me. You left me. You filed for divorce. You exposed my secrets. He took a step toward me, and I saw the rage burning behind his eyes. You ruined everything. Oh no, Ethan. You ruined everything. You ruined us. You ruined Sophie. You ruined the life we built together. You took my arm, he said suddenly, and the words were so unexpected that I almost laughed. Your arm. You took my arm when you saved Sophie. He gestured at my empty sleeve. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it every day? The way you walk around with your missing limb, reminding everyone of what you sacrificed. Always the victim, Emma. Always the hero. I stared at him, stunned. You can't be serious. He was lurching toward me, his face contorted with rage. You should have let her die. She was my sister. It was my choice. And you took it away from me. You're insane. I'm sane enough to know that I never should have married you. I never should have let you into my life. You've been destroying me since the day we met. I was backing away now, my heart racing. Ethan. You need help. This isn't you. It is me, he said. It's always been me. And you finally get to see what I really am. I don't remember much after that. Just a blur of movement, a flash of pain, and then blackness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. James was beside me, his hand holding mine, his face pale with worried. Emma, he said, his voice cracking. Emma, can you hear me? I blinked, trying to focus. What happened? Ethan attacked you. He tried to kill you. James paused, his eyes filling with tears. You were in a coma for 3 days. I closed my eyes and suddenly I remembered everything. The fire. The pain. The look on Ethan's face as he'd lunged for me, but I wasn't dead. I was alive in a hospital with the man I loved. Where is he? I asked. Arrested. He's in jail. I felt something release in my chest. And Sophie? She's safe. James squeezed my hand. She's been here every day. She won't leave your side. I smiled and I felt the tears start to fall. I'm okay, I said. I'm going to be okay. And I meant it. Because I'd been through worse and I'd survived. I'd given up my arm, my marriage, my life. And I'd come out stronger. Ethan might have broken my body, but he could never break my spirit. That end of chapter 3. The hospital room was too quiet. I'd been awake for 3 days now. And the silence was starting to get to me. The beeping of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant hum of the city beyond the window. None of it could fill the hollow space that had opened up inside my chest. I'd survived Ethan's attack, survived the coma, survived the surgery to repair the damage he'd done. But survival, I was learning, was only the beginning. James was asleep in the chair beside my bed, his head tilted back, his hand still loosely holding mine. He'd barely left my side since I'd woken up. The nurses had tried to make him go home to rest, to take care of himself, but he'd refused. He'd planted himself in that chair like a sentinel, and nothing short of force could move him. I watched him sleep, and I felt a surge of love so intense it almost hurt. He was beautiful in the pale light of the hospital room, his dark lashes fanned against his cheeks, his lips slightly parted. He'd been through so much because of me. He'd watched me nearly die, and he'd stayed. The door opened, and Sophie slipped inside. She looked better than she had the night she'd called me. Her face was fuller, her eyes brighter. She'd been staying with James and me, rebuilding her life, trying to put the pieces back together. The bruises on her arms had faded to faint yellow marks, and she'd started smiling again. Hey, she whispered, patting over to my bed. How are you feeling? Better. I squeezed her hand. The doctors say I might be able to go home next week. She smiled, and for a moment, she looked like the little girl I'd saved all those years ago. Innocent and hopeful and full of life. I'm glad, she said. I don't think I can handle another night of James pacing the hallways like a caged animal. I laughed softly, careful not to wake him. He's been like that since I woke up. He's been like that since you went into surgery. She sat down on the edge of my bed, her expression turning serious. Emma, I need to tell you something. What is it? The police found Ethan's journal. In his apartment, hidden under the floorboards. They gave it to me, because I'm his next of kin. She paused, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. I read it. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to understand. And Emma, there's a lot in there about you. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of things? Bad things. She handed me a small notebook, its cover battered and stained. You should read it. But I want you to know before you do, none of it is true. He was sick. He was broken. And everything he said about you, it was just him trying to justify the things he'd done. I took the journal from her, my hands trembling. The leather cover was soft and worn, and I could smell the desperation on its pages. I opened it slowly, scanning the cramped, angry handwriting. And I started to read that the journal was a confession that Ethan had written it in the weeks before his attack on me, during the long, dark nights when his life had fallen apart. He'd written about his childhood, his father's abuse, his mother's neglect. He'd written about the way he'd learned to manipulate people, to lie and cheat and steal to get what he wanted. And he'd written about me. Emma was supposed to be my redemption. She was supposed to fix everything. Her family was rich, her connections powerful. All I had to do was marry her. and I'd have everything I'd ever wanted. Asterisk. Asterisk, but she was so needy, so desperate for love. I couldn't stand the way she looked at me like I was her whole world. It made me sick. I wanted to break her to make her stop needing me so much. Asterisk, asterisk, I didn't expect her to save Sophie. I didn't expect her to lose her arm. That wasn't part of the plan. But when it happened, I saw my way out. I could blame her for ruining our lives. I could make her feel guilty for the accident. And she'd stay because she believed she deserved it. Asterisk, asterisk, I kept her broken for years. I told her she was ugly, that she was worthless, that no one else would ever want her. And she believed me. She was so easy to control. So pathetic in her desperation, asterisk. Asterisk, and then she left. She found her spine and she destroyed me. She took everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for. She made me a laughingstock, a failure, a nobody. Asterisk, asterisk, I hate her. I hate her more than I've ever hated anyone. And I'm going to make her pay. Asterisk, I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Sophie was watching me, her eyes full of tears. Emma, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he was capable of this. I thought he was just a bad brother. But this? He was a monster, I said, my voice flat. He was always a monster. I just didn't want to see it. I set the journal down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. The weight of everything Ethan had written pressed down on me like a physical force. All those years, all those moments of cruelty and neglect, they'd been intentional. He'd wanted to break me. He'd wanted to make me small. And I'd let him. I'd let him convince me that I was worthless, that I was broken, that I deserved everything he'd done to me. But I wasn't worthless. I wasn't broken. I was a survivor. I should have seen it, I said softly. All the signs were there. The way he talked to me, the way he treated me. I knew something was wrong, but I told myself it was normal, that all marriages were like that. Sophie reached for my hand. That's what abusers do. They make you doubt yourself. They make you think you're the problem. I looked at her. She was so young but so wise. She'd been through her own nightmare, and she'd come out the other side. You're going to be okay, I told her. We both are. The next few days passed in a blur. The doctors released me and James took me home. Sophie moved into the guest room, and we started building a life together. The three of us, a strange and unexpected family. James cooked dinner every night. Sophie painted, filling the walls with bright colors and abstract shapes. And I started writing, chronicling my experiences in a journal of my own. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was a reckoning. A way of making sense of everything that had happened, of giving voice to the years of silence. And when the journal was finished, I sent it to a publisher. The book came out 6 months later. It was called The Arm I Gave. And it was my story. The story of a woman who'd given everything to a man who deserved nothing. I wrote about the accident, the amputation, the years of emotional abuse. I wrote about the divorce, the betrayal, the slow, painful process of reclaiming my life. I didn't hold back. I wrote about Ethan's cruelty in brutal detail, about Miranda's manipulation, about the way they'd stripped me of my dignity and my self-worth, and then I wrote about the aftermath, about Sophie and James and the new life I'd built from the ashes of the old. The book was a sensation. It was picked up by major publishers. It was translated into 12 languages. It was optioned for a movie adaptation. Readers from around the world reached out to me, telling me how my story had inspired them, how it had given them the courage to leave their own abusive relationships. I became a spokesperson for survivors of domestic abuse. I traveled the country, giving speeches, advocating for stronger protections for victims. I met with lawmakers, testified before Congress, pushed for changes that would make it harder for abusers to manipulate the system. It was hard work. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and often painful. But it was also deeply satisfying that I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. I was a fighter. And I was finally, truly freed. The day Ethan was sentenced, I was in court. He was convicted of attempted murder, assault, and 12 other charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. When the judge announced the verdict, I felt something lift off my shoulders. Something that had been there for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to be free. I looked at Ethan as they led him away in handcuffs. He stared back at me, his eyes full of hatred and confusion. You did this to me, he said, his voice low and venomous. You ruined my life. I shook my head. No, Ethan. You ruined your own life. I just made sure you couldn't ruin anyone else's. He was gone before I could say anything else. The doors closed behind him, and I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. James was waiting for me. He held out his hand and I took it. Are you okay? He asked. I smiled. I'm more than okay. I'm free. The years passed and I built a life I could never have imagined. I continued my advocacy work, expanding my consulting firm to include a foundation for survivors. Sophie went to college, graduated with honors, and started her own nonprofit dedicated to helping young women escape abusive situations. James and I got married. A small ceremony on the beach, just us and Sophie and a handful of close friends. I still dreamed about Ethan sometimes. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my phantom arm aching, convinced I could hear his voice in the darkness. But the dreams grew less frequent over time, replaced by dreams of James and Sophie, and the future we were building together. That I thought about the night I'd saved Sophie, about the choice I'd made without hesitation. I thought about the arm I'd lost, the years I'd spent suffering, the impossible weight of the life I'd endured. And I thought about the man who'd said I deserved it, the man who'd tried to destroy me, and the man I'd finally, completely, and utterly moved beyond. Ethan was in prison now. He'd be there for decades. He'd spend the rest of his life thinking about what he'd done, replaying the decisions that had led him to this moment. And I'd be out here, living the life he'd tried to take away from me. I thought about his words in the hospital room. Asterisk. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it every day, the way you walk around with your missing limb, reminding everyone of what you sacrificed. Asterisk. He'd been wrong, of course. I didn't walk around reminding people of my sacrifice. I walked around reminding people of my survival, of my strength, of the fact that I'd been broken, and I'd still found a way to heal. That was my real victory. Not the revenge, not the book, not the money or the fame. It was the knowledge that I'd survived, and I'd kept going, and I'd found a way to be happy. I looked at James, who was smiling at me from across the table. I looked at Sophie, who was laughing at something on her phone, and I felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost knocked me over. I'd lost my arm. I'd lost my marriage. I'd lost years of my life to a man who'd never deserved my love. But I'd gained something far more valuable. I'd gained myself. That night, I sat on the balcony of our home, staring up at the stars. The phantom ache in my arm was gone, replaced by a quiet peace that settled deep in my bones. I thought about the little girl I'd saved, the one who'd grown into a woman I was proud to call a friend. I thought about the man who loved me, the one who'd never once looked at my scars with pity. I thought about the life I'd built, the work I'd done, the difference I'd made. And I thought about the words I'd written in my journal, so long ago. Asterisk. I lost my arm saving his sister. He said I deserved it. But he was wrong. I deserved better. And I finally know that. Asterisk. I smiled and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I'd get up and do it all again. I'd fight for survivors. I'd tell my story. I'd keep building the life I'd earned. But tonight I was going to rest. I was going to let myself be grateful for everything I'd been given. Because I'd survived. And that was the greatest victory of all. ###. End of chapter. For the trial was over, the verdict delivered, the sentence handed down. Ethan had been led away in chains, his face a mask of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that his reign of cruelty had finally come to an end. I'd watched him go, and I'd felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, no relief. Just a quiet emptiness that I knew would take time to fill. But today I wasn't thinking about Ethan. Today I was standing in the driveway of the house I'd once shared with him, and I was finally ready to let it go. The real estate agent had called me that morning, her voice bright and efficient. The house had sold. The new owners were moving in next week, and I needed to collect the last of my belongings. I told her I'd be there by noon. James had offered to come with me, but I'd refused. This was something I needed to do alone. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint was peeling in places, the front porch sagging slightly under the weight of years. When I'd lived here, I'd thought it was the most beautiful house in the world. I'd scrubbed its floors, polished its windows, filled it with flowers and love and desperate hope. Now it was just a building. Just wood and plaster and empty rooms that I unlocked the front door with the key I'd never returned. And I stepped inside that the silence was deafening, that the living room was empty, stripped of furniture and memories. The walls were bare, the floor scuffed, the light fixtures gone. It looked like a tomb, a monument to everything I'd lost, but I hadn't come here to mourn. I'd come here to reclaim. That I walked through the house, room by room, touching the walls, the floors, the empty spaces where my life had once been. The kitchen, where I'd cooked Ethan's favorite meals and pretended he loved me. The bedroom, where I'd cried myself to sleep 1,000 times. The bathroom, where I'd stared at my empty sleeve and wondered if I was still worth loving. And then I went to the basement. That I'd avoided this room for years. In the early days of my marriage, I'd used it as a storage space, filling it with boxes of things I couldn't bear to throw away. After the accident, I'd stopped going down there altogether. The stairs were too steep, the lighting too dim, and the memories too painful. But there was something I needed to find. That I descended the stairs slowly, my good hand gripping the railing. The air was cool and musty, and the faint smell of dust tickled my nose. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their labels faded and peeling. I found the one I was looking for in the far corner. That it was a small cardboard box, its edges worn soft by time. The label on the side read, in my own handwriting, *, Emma's things keep. *, I'd written it years ago, back when I still believed I was worth keeping. I knelt down and opened the box. Inside, I found a lifetime of memories. Old photographs, school yearbooks, a collection of seashells from a childhood vacation. And at the bottom, wrapped in a faded scarf, was a small velvet pouch. That I knew what was inside before I opened it. I'd put it there myself, years ago, in a moment of despair. The sapphire ring. My grandmother's ring. The only heirloom I'd ever owned. The only piece of jewelry that truly mattered. I'd given it to Ethan as a symbol of my trust, and he'd sold it to pay off a gambling debt. I'd tracked it down years later, bought it back with money I'd saved from my part-time job, and hidden it away in this box. I'd never worn it again. I'd been too ashamed, too convinced that I didn't deserve it. But today, I slipped it onto my finger, and I felt something shift inside me. I was not the woman who'd hidden her grandmother's ring in a dusty box. I was not the woman who'd let Ethan sell her memories, her dignity, her self-worth. I was not the woman who'd cowered in the shadows, afraid to be seen. I was the woman who'd survived. The woman who'd fought back. The woman who'd walked away from everything she'd known to build something better. I closed the box and carried it back up the stairs. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. I stood in the driveway and looked at the house one last time. I thought about the girl who'd moved in here, young and hopeful and full of dreams. I thought about the woman who'd left, broken and battered and barely alive. And I thought about the person I'd become, the person who'd clawed her way back from the edge. I'd spent so long hating this house, hating the memories it held, hating the life I'd lived within its walls. But I'd also spent so long forgetting that it wasn't the house that had broken me. It was the man who'd lived in it. And he was gone now, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else. Goodbye, I whispered to the empty building. I hope the next family who lives here finds more happiness than I did. I turned to leave and I saw her. Sophie was standing at the end of the driveway, her hands in her pockets, her eyes fixed on me. She was wearing a familiar jacket, an old denim jacket I'd given her years ago, back when she was still a child. I thought you might need a ride, she said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I laughed, a surprised sound that echoed in the quiet evening air. How did you know I was here? James told me. She walked toward me, her footsteps soft on the pavement. He said you needed to do this alone, but I couldn't let you come back to an empty house. So I waited. Just in case. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Sophie, she reached me and pulled me into a hug. She was taller than she'd been when we'd first met, stronger, more confident. She'd grown into a woman I was proud to know. It's over, she said softly. It's finally over. I nodded into her shoulder. It is. She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes shining. So what happens now? I thought about my life, my work, my future. I thought about James, who was waiting for me at home with dinner on the stove and a smile on his face. I thought about the foundation I'd built, the survivors I'd helped, the lives I'd touched. And I thought about the ring on my finger, warm and bright in the fading light. Now, I said, I live. We drove home in comfortable silence, the windows down and the wind in our hair. Sophie dropped me off at the house I shared with James, and she waved goodbye as I walked up the path. James was waiting on the porch, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of my footsteps. Emma, he said, his voice warm and familiar. You're back. I'm back. I sat down beside him, my shoulder brushing his. And I brought something with me. Something. I took his hand and pressed it to my grandmother's ring. His fingers traced the stone, the band, the intricate setting. It's beautiful, he said. What is it? My grandmother's ring. I gave it to Ethan once, and he threw it away. But I found it again. And I think. I paused, gathering my words. I think I'd like to give it to you. To keep. James was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled me into his arms. Emma, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You're the strongest person I've ever met. And I would be honored to carry this for you. I let myself fall into his embrace, and I felt the weight of years lift off my shoulders that I'd spent so long defined by my pain, my loss, my anger. I'd let the man who'd hurt me dictate who I was and who I could become. But no more. I'd walked away from the house of my nightmares. I'd walked away from the memories that had been holding me back. And now, I was walking toward something new. The years passed, and I kept walking. I built a life filled with purpose and joy. I woke up every morning next to James, feeling his warmth beside me, his love surrounding me. I went to work at my foundation, helping survivors reclaim their lives. I watched Sophie grow into a fierce advocate, a woman who'd turned her pain into power. I never forgot the arm I'd lost. I never forgot the pain I'd endured. But I stopped letting it define me. Ethan was released from prison after 12 years. An early parole I'd opposed but couldn't stop. I was in the courtroom when he walked out, his face aged and hollow. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd once loved. But then he looked away, and I knew he wasn't coming for me. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He'd lost his power over me the day I'd walked away. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a survivor. I was just a woman who'd lived through something terrible, and come out the other side. And I'd brought everyone I loved with me. The last time I visited Ethan's grave, it was raining. He'd died 6 months after his release, alone and forgotten. The funeral had been small, attended by a few distant relatives and a lawyer who'd been hired to settle his affairs. I'd gone to pay my respects, not out of forgiveness, but out of closure. I stood at his grave, the rain soaking through my coat, and I thought about everything that had brought us here. The love, the lies, the betrayal. The arm I'd lost, the life I'd rebuilt. And I thought about something Sophie had said to me years ago when we'd been sitting in the hospital room, watching the sun rise over the city. You walked away from him. She'd said. That was the bravest thing you could have done. She'd been right. Walking away hadn't been easy. It had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. But it had also been the most necessary. I looked down at Ethan's grave and I felt nothing. No sadness, no anger, no regret. Just a quiet peace that had taken years to earn. Goodbye, I said softly. I turned and walked away. The rain was beginning to let up, and through the clouds I could see the faintest glimmer of sunlight. I thought about James waiting for me at home. I thought about Sophie, thriving in her new career. I thought about the ring on my finger, warm against my skin. I'd lost my arm saving his sister. He'd said I deserved it. But I knew the truth now, the truth I'd been too afraid to see for so many years. I didn't deserve to suffer. I deserved to live, to love, to be happy. And so I was. I smiled as I walked toward the car. The rain was stopping and the sun was finally breaking through. The day I walked away was the day I truly began. End of chapter 5. The end.